All right, we can check this mic. This mic's on. Okay, I think we're back. So normally, I don't stand up here, I normally stand down there. I feel very far away. So now that we're switching back to our Sunday school classes, and we're back in here, I have to get used to this. Oh, it's really little. All right, so we're starting a new series in here today on Colossians and Philemon. Pastor is starting a new one on Bible doctrines down the hall, which seems evidently far more exciting than Colossians and Philemon. Not that it's a competition or anything, but I didn't expect it to go that way. So we'll go ahead and get started and introduce the series today and talk a little bit about the New Testament and Paul. Actually, some of what Pastor said today we'll talk a little bit about. And then next week we'll try to get into Colossians in particular. So I have not, this is a new study for me, just by way of history. I did a study on Philemon last year when I was filling in pulpit at Morris, and I preached seven or eight messages on the book of Philemon there in a series. I preached one of those sermons here, and I have 2 Sundays coming up in February where Pastor has asked me to preach, and I'll preach out of Philemon at that time here. When I went to seminary, the instructor I had us do a book study on the book of Ephesians. We did 2 Peter and Ephesians. And the faculty member who came after him did Colossians. And the current instructor does Colossians as well. So I've never gone through Colossians in great detail, so I wanted something new to learn. And thought it would be a good study. I've been studying Philemon, and there's some overlap there. The reason for the overlap, just to give away a little bit here, is Paul wrote both of those letters at the same time. Philemon was a man who is a member of the church in Colossae. And so Paul wrote a letter to the church in Colossae, but he at the same time wrote the letter to Philemon as a member of the church. So that's why they go together. And they're both relatively short. Okay, so I don't have a real detailed, although I'm working on making a little bit more detailed outline of study. This is too small. I need to make that bigger. Yes, I can tell. My glasses won't help read back there. But today we're going to look at Paul in general and his letters, kind of Paul's timeline, where he was, what he was doing. Paul wrote 13 letters that we have in our New Testament. If you count the amount of space given to Paul in the book of Acts, and you add up all of Paul's letters, he comes close, if not surpassing Luke in the volume of material we have on Paul. So Paul is obviously a very significant character in the New Testament and in the teachings of the church. Then next week, Lord willing, we'll look at Colossians and Philemon in particular. When were they written? More information about those, the place, Colossae, and the person Philemon. We'll look at a little bit more detail at that in particular. And then we'll work our way through Colossians, and then we'll spend a Sunday in Philemon. Probably just one, I would guess, in Philemon. So the question in my mind is, how much time do I want to spend in the book of Colossians? So normally I like to try to make a Sunday school class about 10 to 12 weeks and then move on to another topic. We should be able to do that in Colossians. But Colossians is short, but there's a lot of information in it. So I don't know that necessarily we could go fast, but we'll try to answer questions. as we do that. Okay, a little what we would call New Testament introduction first. So to talk about the New Testament, we have the New Testament's generally speaking is broken into 3 sections. Sometimes you'll see the book of Acts kind of on its own, and sometimes you'll see Revelation kind of on its own. One of the kids' Sunday school classes has a really good poster that kind of outlines the New Testament and groups the books. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the 4 gospel witnesses that we have. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very close. They are very similar to each other. So they are often grouped together. Does anyone know what those 3 are called? What the big word is for that? Yeah. What one word is used to group them together? Yes, Synoptic Gospels. Daryl gets the A for the class today. Now I need someone to get an... I always grade on a curve. I need someone to take an F. Paul, I need someone to take an F for today. Are you... Daryl got the A. Okay. Yeah, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels, and the word synoptic means similar. They're from the similar perspectives, or same perspective. That's what the word synoptic means. So they're similar in their content in the life of Christ. All 3 of them include the birth of Christ. All 3 of them include the baptism of Christ, his teachings, his miracles. Mark is obviously the shortest of those. Luke is obviously the longest. Matthew goes first because it's so Jewish in nature, Matthew being a Jew. It's so Jewish in nature that some people think that he originally wrote it in either Hebrew or Aramaic, and it was later translated to Greek. And I don't agree with that view, only because all we have are Greek transcripts. We don't have any evidence to support that. But that's why Matthew goes first. He's close to the Old Testament. And then we have Mark, who is written by John Mark, with the Apostle Peter looking over his shoulder. And then we have Luke. Luke was he was a doctor. He was a well-to-do man. Did great research. Spent a lot of time with Mary. That's why in Luke's gospel you have a lot of these things that says, and Mary hid these things in her heart. Mary didn't tell anyone. Mary, it's like, well, then how did Luke find out? Mary didn't tell anyone. But after the death of Jesus, Luke spent several years with Mary learning these things and writing them down. Luke also spends a lot of time with Paul in the book of Acts. We know that from the book of Acts. John writes his gospel much later, almost 50 years, probably 50 years after Matthew writes his. And so John's comes a lot later. It's the gospel written for the whole world, and so it comes last. And then Acts, the full title of the book is the Acts of the Apostles, and that's why we put it with the Gospels. It's more about the apostles and what they were doing after the resurrection of Christ. So then, those who collected the New Testament put it together. They took all of Paul's writings and they shoved them together. And what they did is they organized them by length. So you have, first in Paul's letters, you have all of the letters to the churches. So Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Those are all letters to the churches. And the longest one is Romans, and the shortest one is 2nd Thessalonians. Okay, so they're actually in length order. And then they put together his personal letters, and they did the same thing. 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon, from longest to shortest. So they're not in chronological order or grouped thematically. They're just by length. And then you have, in the last column, you have everything that's not Paul. So sometimes called the general letters, or most often I guess we just call them the general letters, or epistles is the other word for letter. So Hebrews is first in that list, because there's some controversy as to whether Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. It was not accepted, I don't accept that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. But there were some in the early church who thought Paul did write the book of Hebrews, and that's why it comes right after Paul's letters, just in case Paul did write it. We'll just leave it really close. And then you have, but otherwise we don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews, so it's anonymous. Then you have James, Peter's writings, John's writings, Jude's writings, and then the book of Revelation. Book of Revelation was probably written last anyway. It's by the Apostle John, and sometimes it's set off by itself. It is a letter to the 7 churches, and it was written by John, but it's of a different kind, so it's put at the end of our New Testament. So these are what we call the inspired texts. We don't. We know that there's more letters to the Corinthians. For example, we know that they did exist. Paul references them in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. We know that 1st and 2nd Corinthians, for example, is actually the 2nd and 4th letters that Paul wrote. We don't have 1 and 3. So anyway, those writings, the Lord, through his providence, we don't need. So those were not inspired. So this is kind of where the New Testament is. So Colossians is in Paul's letters. You can see one of the shortest ones, and that's why it comes towards the end. That's how our New Testament is put together. Any questions on that? I don't want to make any assumptions here. We're all good with that. Well, it would be pretty close to by words. It might be by lines. That's a good question. I don't know if it's by words or by lines. It depends on what manuscript you're looking at. So if you're looking at it in the Greek. Most of our manuscripts in Greek would be by lines, not by words. So compiled by whom? So the early church, there's a couple convenings, I guess you could call it, church councils, where they evaluated what texts were legitimate for the New Testament church and which ones were not. One takes place in 70 AD, and we don't have all the manuscripts yet written because John hasn't written anything yet in 70 AD. And I should back up too, is the Old Testament was already done. Okay, so there's no question on what's in or out of the Old Testament. That question is answered long before Christ is on the scene. And so the church choice to adopt the Old Testament as authoritative is very early. I mean, we see that in Jesus' day. Jesus came to teach the law, to fulfill the law, and to teach the law. So much of Jesus' teaching is actually a proper interpretation of the law. The early church, their text that they preached from, for example, on the day of Pentecost, comes from the Old Testament, because they don't have a New Testament yet. We learn from Ephesians that the New Testament was given apostles and New Testament prophets to give them communication about what this new thing is, this thing called the church, and how we're supposed to behave ourselves. Once all those things are written down, we don't need those apostles and prophets any longer, because we have what they said that we need to know is recorded in the New Testament. So the first big convening of that was in 70 AD, and then there's another one around 180. Another church historian. Church history to me ends in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. Just kidding. It's an Old Testament joke. I think it's about 180. I want to say 180. AD is when they finally have answered that question. There are other writings that come up in the 2nd century that start coming up in the 2nd century that they have to distinguish. Is this inspired or is it not inspired? John, the Apostle John, has an apostle named Clement who's also writing letters about 100 AD. The Apostle John lives to not quite 100 AD, so in the 90s he dies. And he has a disciple who lives into the 2nd century. This is one of the Clements. And he's writing letters to churches too. But they're not considered inspired, and they're not considered authoritative. The church has said that these are the only ones. And they had some tests to go along with that. Was it written by an apostle? That's a big one. So most of these are written directly by apostles or influenced directly by apostles, like the Gospel of Mark. Are they consistent with what we know in the life of teaching of Jesus Christ? So the Gospel of Thomas is a 2nd century gospel that the Catholic Church accepts that we don't accept, because the teachings within the Gospel of Thomas are not consistent with the teachings of Christ as found in the other Gospels. So it was rejected. So they had some tests that they used to figure out what should be in the New Testament, what should not. In the short answer is God in his providence has guided and directed them in doing this. They recognized what was inspired. They did not declare what was inspired. That's a difference between the Protestant view and the Roman Catholic view. The Roman Catholic view, they declared what was inspired. We say they recognized what was inspired. So, a little difference from that. Did I answer your question? Oh, yeah. It was what was recognized was way back in the 2nd century, and of course the King James Version was a Catholic Bible essentially, so it had many other books that we wouldn't have in it. It had the Apocrypha in it, New Testament Apocrypha in it. So it was a lot bigger on that regard. All right, so here we are. So this map, I should come down there and see it from your perspective. And I don't have a laser pointer that works either on the screen. So this map, I wanted to give you a kind of a big picture of the New Testament world. In the far up left-hand corner is Rome. And then you can see Macedonia across the top there, Italy, Macedonia. That's where Macedonia is today. By the way, Macedonia was re-recognized as an independent nation here not that long ago, within the last 30 years, 20 years maybe. See Thessalonica and Philippi are towards the top there, Corinth towards the bottom. Ephesus stands out. And you'll notice on that third part on the right, it says Asia Minor. So in the New Testament, especially when you're reading the book of Acts and some of Paul's letters, they refer to Asia. And what they're referring to is modern-day Turkey. Okay, so Asia Minor on this map, and you'll notice it says Asia in smaller letters next to Galatia. Asia Minor is Turkey. But they sometimes referred to it as Asia back then. And so that's what they're talking about. They're not talking about the vast continent of Asia. They're just talking about what is today Turkey, modern-day Turkey. Galatia is a region. I have another slide that shows some regions of Asia Minor. This map also shows Colossae on it, so you can see kind of where that's at in the middle of the south of Asia Minor. If you keep going to the right, there's a little Tarsus, you can see that, and then Jerusalem is in the lower right-hand corner. So the Romans had built their highway system, some of which still exists to this day. By the way, it's rather remarkable. In Minnesota, something is really, really old if it dates back to 1850. The things that the Romans did 2,000 years ago still exist to this day. And it's remarkable that you can point to something and go, oh yeah, that's 2,000 years old. That's when that road was laid, or that wall was built, or something like that. So they had a highway that went through Asia Minor from Syria, Antioch, and there was another highway that goes all the way back to the ancient Egyptians that runs down the Mediterranean Sea, down around to Egypt. So ancient Egypt, before the Greeks settled Egypt, conquered Egypt, ancient Egypt back in the days of Abraham, there's a highway that runs up that coast along the Mediterranean. Mike, did you get to go to the Mediterranean on your trip? Did you go to the Mediterranean on your trip? So which, north or south? Which part? Syria's on there. So Tel Aviv is right off the map to the right. A little bit farther, Tel Aviv would be down by where it says Judea, Samaria, Judea. Those words in the lower right-hand corner is where modern day Tel Aviv is. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep, way up here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Jeremiah had attended here for a couple of years, and not too long ago, moved out west to be closer to family. But now he's living in California, Paul said. Yeah. Okay. So. So keep praying for Jeremiah. He hasn't been feeling well. He's having a hard time keeping a job because of that. And Jeremiah's parents were our missionaries in northern Turkey, up by this way up here, because I lose my cursor. That's the Black Sea. Yeah, they are, but I can't point to the south edge of the Black Sea because my pointer disappeared. But this is the Black Sea up here. And they're missionaries there, so JT or Jeremiah had grown up there. But there's a highway. The highway runs across Asia on the south side, the highway that the Romans built. And so we'll see that here, Paul's ministries. So this is Asia Minor in more detail and more cities. You can see now that Syria down here, Syria, and more of these regions. Tarsus is where Paul is born, in the province of Cilicia, or Cilicia, as it would have been pronounced back then. Galatia is this large province in the middle, and there are a lot of cities in Galatia, and so like the book of Galatians is written to a number of churches, not just one church, but actually a number of churches in a bunch of small towns on the highway that runs through southern Galatia. And then you have Asia on the eastern side, or western side there, Lydia, Ephesus, some names that show up again in the book of Acts. So Paul is actually born in Tarsus, over in that corner, as a Roman citizen, even though Paul is a Jew. and a devout Jew at that. So this map doesn't have Colossians, the city of Colossae on it. The city of Colossae is there by Pisidia on this map. Okay, so Paul's life and writings. So to give us kind of a timeline of Paul, we're not exactly sure when Paul is born. He's probably born after Christ was born, but not necessarily significantly after Christ was born. So when Christ died, Paul might have been 20. Maybe he was about 20. Jesus was about 30, 33 if you take the history. And so maybe Paul was born about 10, somewhere between 6 and 10 AD in our chronology. This has his conversion quite a bit later, 34, 35. He might have been younger. We learn most of Paul's history from the book of Acts. There's a couple places where Paul gives his testimony, and we find out a little bit more about him. One of those is Acts 22. We might want to just look at that one. Paul's testimony is given 3 times in the book of Acts. And again, Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, traveled with Paul on a few occasions. So if you're ever reading the book of Acts and it switches from Paul did this and then we did that, that's where Luke is traveling with Paul and writing a first-hand account of their trip. Acts 22. Here we go. So this is Paul speaking, and Paul is, he's been arrested, and he wants to address the crowd. So he says, "Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you." And then there's an interruption. When they heard that he was addressing them in Hebrew, they became even more quiet. So he's addressing a Jewish crowd at the temple in Jerusalem. They think that Paul is a Roman, but Paul is a Jew. So they're surprised to hear him speaking Hebrew. So Paul knew Hebrew, Paul knew Aramaic, he knew Greek, and he knew Latin. Paul's very well educated, as we'll see here in his speaking. He says, "I am a Jew." So he starts with that. "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia," we would say today, "but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day." So we find out a little bit about his growing up years here. He was born in Tarsus. He spent a lot of time in Jerusalem. And Paul was very zealous. He mentions in Philippians 3 that he was a Pharisee and born in the tribe of Benjamin. So Paul was an Old Testament scholar. Gamaliel is a well-known teacher or rabbi during this time in Jerusalem. So this would be kind of like, once in a while you hear this in higher education, for lack of a better term. But you'll hear this especially with musicians. Musicians always tell you who they studied under. When I graduated with my PhD, I had to include who my dissertation advisor was. I don't know if you had to do that, right? We have to give credit to the person. We don't get credit for it. Someone else gets credit for what we just almost died doing, right? So they just stood there and went, "Yeah, that looks okay," and so we had to go through it. But so musicians, you see this all the time. If you read or go to a concert and it's got a soloist, it'll show what schools. Oh, this person studied at Juilliard under, so-and-so. And it's like, that means they must be good. No, it doesn't. It just means that they studied at school under that person. But it's a way. It really is a way of name dropping, so to speak. We would say. Paul is doing that here. He was a Pharisee who was trained under this particular rabbi, not any particular rabbi. This particular rabbi. And I mentioned I grew up with friends who were Jewish, and I went to their bar mitzvahs, and this was a thing. Who trained you? Who taught you how to read the scriptures and how to read the prayers and all of those things and that go along with it. So this is Paul. Paul he is a Jew. He's born a Jew. He's actually of the tribe of Benjamin, we find out in Philippians. He studied under Gamaliel, this great rabbi in Jerusalem that everybody knew. He was considered a great rabbi and a very wise man. He was raised according to the strict manner of the law of the fathers. And again, he was a Pharisee. So he was extremely strict as it pertained to the law and keeping the law and trying to find righteousness in the law. And he says, he gives them credit for their zealousness. He was just as zealous as they were. He persecuted the way, or the early believers, to the death, binding them and delivering them to prison, both men and women. And he stood, we're told in Acts, he stood there and watched the stoning of Stephen. So he watched his fellow Jews who were zealous for the law put Stephen to death for blasphemy. And he stood, and Luke tells us he stood there and held their coats, or they laid their coats at his feet. He watched over them as they stoned Stephen. And then he would go on later and try to persecute them. So this is in Acts chapter 9 that tells us about this persecution. And in verse 5 he says, "As the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness," because he had to get permission from them. He says, "From them, the elders and the high priest, right there at the temple, gave him letters to the brothers, and I journeyed towards Damascus to take those who were there and bring them bonds to Jerusalem to be punished." Now, I don't have that on the map. Damascus is to the right. Well, it's actually where the word Syria is, maybe about where the letter I or A is in Syria. That's where Damascus was.